recording. Okay. So I'll put a link to this character design notes uh, in the Discord voice channel chat if you want to follow along. And we're basically just going to talk a little bit about how character design works in games. And so it's a little bit of a focus on character design specifically for like the player character or the character that you control when you're playing a game. But this most of these design principles would sort of apply to any character, NPC or enemy or other characters that you might have in a game. And so what we're going to talk about that, and then obviously relate that to what we're going to do a little bit later, which is design a character. Okay. So here's some really simple characters. These are obviously, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with these characters from Pac-Man from 1980. And these are good examples of character designs. And we'll kind of talk about a lot of what we'll look at throughout the semester is kind of the relationship between the technology and the aesthetics of games. And that kind of like really plays into a lot of the different conventions that we see in games. So these are obviously like pixelated characters, and we've been working with Pascal, which is a pixel art program. And even though with a modern computer, we can make much more high level of detail, a lot of games are still made with this aesthetic because it's kind of this reference to this history where we had a lot less memory and a lot less screen space to work with. And that kind of created these constraints, which in some ways were good for creating these simple, easily identifiable characters. So one of the really cool things about Pac-Man is that it's this really great character design, really, really simple, but it communicates two important things. It gives a player an avatar in the game world that's easy to identify with. And it does that simply by making Pac-Man the brightest color on the screen. So it's this yellow color. And so it's very easy to identify. It's also just one color as opposed to the other characters, which have multiple colors that also fit within the same color scheme. And then the other thing that we want to do with our character design is indicate the functionality of the character. So remember when we talked about in our intro to game design, we talked about how everything in a video game is related to it being interactive. The thing that makes a game is its interactivity. And so our player character, which is the avatar for the human user of the game, that character should indicate its functionality, how it's going to interact in the world to the user. And Pac-Man does that in this incredibly simple way, which is that it's basically just the ball with a mouth. And in the game, we're trying to eat these dots and run away from the ghost. So everything that we need to know about Pac-Man is communicated through this very simple design. So another early game that you guys are all probably pretty familiar with. This takes the game design, the character design, in a slightly different direction, where there's actually these kind of specific details to Mario that give the character something that's kind of more. We kind of can identify components of the character that would be from the real world, like his hat and his overalls, his mustache, things like that. Those are things that connect the character to a real world identity. Let's see. So in this case, we have a more sort of cinematic type of character design where it doesn't actually relate necessarily to the functionality of the game. I mean, it's sort of related because he goes into these pipes and he's a plumber and stuff like that. It's not necessarily directly related. It's more of a sort of cinematic representation of a person that we can identify with on the screen. So it's a slightly higher level of sophistication. And that's another thing that we'll kind of talk about. Well, we'll get into it. I don't need to skip ahead. Another really even earlier, even simpler version of a character design, Space Invaders. We are the green spaceship, and we're facing in one direction, and we can move back and forth, and it's very, very simple. So in early video games, there's a lot of limitations in terms of the physical hardware that led to these sort of choices when it comes to character design and the design of the game in general, where you were limited by the physical space, the number of colors that you could represent, and so that led to these, that kind of led to some of these limitations, led to a lot of the decisions of these very simple characters that communicated very directly. So this is jumping a little bit ahead, but this is kind of what I was talking about previously. This is a game from 2009. This is I think, considered like the first endless runner game, and it was the first like very popular mobile game, or one of the first anyway. It's called Cannibalt. I doubt that this is a game you guys would probably be familiar with. It kind of disappeared after it was like pretty popular for a couple of years. Oh, really? So you okay? So people are familiar with it. That's cool. But yeah, so in this game, we see this kind of like pixel aesthetic return, and the character design is similarly very simple. The character is just a black and white, kind of simple, almost silhouette of a character that stands out against the kind of more detailed gray background. And so in this screen, we have a lot more data to work with, a lot more pixels to work with, but the character design is still very, very simple. And in general, today, as I mentioned, we don't really have any limitations in terms of the hardware. I mean, we do still have some limitations, but generally, if you want to draw something, you can pretty much use as many colors and as much detail as you want to on a computer. But pixel art and other types of sort of retro aesthetics are still popular because they're related to this history of video games. Another example of a simple character design in a game that has a lot more detail. Limbo is an indie game from 2011 that was really popular. This one, it's a platformer where you're this kind of little boy, and he's distinguished just by these two very bright dots of his eyes. Everything else in the game is kind of like dark and gray and moody, and you can see there is a fair amount of detail in the scenery. Like there's this grass and there's like different layers and there's this sort of depth of focus effect going on, even though it's a 2D platformer. But again, the character still stands out because he's just this simple silhouette with these two really bright eyes. So that makes him stand out on the screen. Another good example of character design, Binding of Isaac. This is really one of my favorite games. It's a dungeon crawler that's procedurally generated, which is something we'll talk about in future lectures. And similarly to Pac-Man, the tears in the eyes of the character represent the character's origin story and also the functionality of the character, where he kind of like shoots tears at the enemies to fight in the gameplay. So video games borrow styles from a lot of different types of media, like cartoons, comics, anime, film, other visual references. But ultimately, we want to kind of create these simple characters that give us an easy avatar to identify with. So this is a panel from Understanding Comics, which is a 1993 comic book that's sort of it's a comic book about comic books, about how comics work. Um, you guys have probably seen this before in classes at some point, but if you haven't, yeah, okay. So yeah, if you haven't seen it before, I highly recommend it. I think I have a link to a PDF of it somewhere. But he has this really great example of this idea of representation versus the cartoon in comics. And so he shows on the left side here is a photograph, like a reproduced photograph, which is sort of this like high level of representation. It looks like a very specific person. And so that kind of gives a specificity and perhaps an authenticity to that character that works well for certain types of media like film or other media. And it may work well in a video game. It's not necessarily the case that you can't have representational characters, but we can see as his features get kind of simplified into different styles of cartoons. Like this is kind of like a more maybe the sort of noir, realistic type cartoon. This is kind of in the middle. It's like a superhero kind of aesthetic, maybe like mid 20th century superhero comic type cartoon. This is like a really simplified, like kind of like Sunday morning cartoon type character. And then on the far right, we just have a blank face with just two eyes and a line for a mouth, which is like all the way on the other side of this sort of like scale of representation. And so on the right, we have something that pretty much anybody who has eyes and a mouth can identify with. They could see themselves in that character. There's no, distinguishing characteristics that make that character represent anything that we kind of associate with the real world. Versus on the far left, we have something that has a lot of distinguishing characteristics that may or may not match the person who's controlling that avatar in the game. So, like in cartoons, in games, we tend towards these more abstract, cartoonish style of characters because it gives more for the player to kind of read themselves into the game. Of course, that's not you can obviously think of a million different games that have highly representational graphics, like especially triple A mass market games that have big budgets and stuff like that. They may have very highly realistic looking characters, but for most of video game history and for a lot of smaller indie games or other types of games that are being made today, that tends to be the convention. Yeah, yeah. There is still a cost of making that type of realistic thing, but it is definitely a lot less than it was, even a few years. Um, so the aesthetic choices that we make with our character design tend to give the player cues or clues about what to expect in the game. Um, so this is applies for NPCs as well, and general design choices within the game. But it kind of gives us cues as to what type of game we're playing, what we might be doing in the game. So a really an article that I really love about character design is by this artist who redesigned the characters from Overwatch in these kind of simpler style 2D drawings. And this isn't how all characters are designed, and it's not like how you have to design a character. But what's cool about it is that he does have this kind of like method that he uses to design the characters. So you don't have to use this exact example, but it's a good to have like a method that you develop over time to create consistency and a unified aesthetic. So in this example, he starts with some basic shapes, and he associates like certain characteristics with those. So again, this is just for this specific example. These aren't like universal rules, but it's helpful to have these kind of guiding concepts. So in his shapes, round is representative of a charismatic, harmless, endearing character. Box is reliable, uniform, traditional, and triangle is cunning, dynamic, and confident. And downward pointing triangle is more aggressive. And so he has these basic rules, and then he can apply them to different characters based on the personalities that they're meant to evoke. And so you can see these characters with simple shapes, and then characters with combined shapes to have combinations of these characteristics to be more complex. And then he talks about assigning, creating the silhouette and assigning colors. And he has, this specific rule for how he assigns colors. So he has, if there's three colors, he has like one main color. It's the 60-30-10 rule. So 60% of the character is the main color, 30% is the secondary color, and then the highlight is just 10% of that color. And, it's probably not exact, but you can see how he has used that across these three characters. And then for using just two colors, he has the 70-30 rule, which is similar. Just 70% is the main color of the character and 30% is the secondary color. So again, these aren't these aren't necessarily requirements of character design, but it's good to come up with these rules that you can apply to all of your characters, so that creates within the game with the different characters, you have they have the same aesthetic or they follow the same conventions. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind, and this is part of the assignment, is that design is always an iterative process. I think this is something that is kind of hard to just absorb in your mind. It's something that you often have to learn. So I'm sure in a lot of your classes, your professors make you do things like multiple drafts of a paper, or multiple drafts of a drawing, or something like that. And it may seem like, I'm just doing this because I have to or whatever, but you'll find, and I have found, and I think most people find, that when you start to actually design and build something for yourself that you just want to build, like a game, a website, whatever it is, your first version is never going to be the best version of it. And it's only through repeating and recreating variations of a character or any type of design that you start to see what are the kind of like limitations, what are the boundaries, like how far can I go in one direction versus another before it starts to break what my goals are. And so we want to always be doing things multiple times to see how do I get the best version of the thing that I'm trying to get. So before finalizing a design, we're going to explore a lot of different possibilities for a character. So that's going to be part of the assignment. We don't really have time to do this for everything in the class, but we're just going to start with that for this example. So we're going to use Pascal. We've already actually looked at Pascal. I think sometimes this is the first thing we do with Pascal, but we've already used it to make an avatar. You guys have already seen Pascal. But just as a reminder, you don't have to use Pascal. That's what I'm using because as I mentioned, it's simple to use. It's specifically designed to work with games, so it makes the asset pipeline a lot simpler. But if you really want to make a game with a different style of art and you want to use Photoshop or Procreate or Blender or whatever it is that you prefer to use, it is possible. There's just going to be more steps from getting that art from what you've created into something that works in the game. And I'll kind of try to, when I do Pascal stuff, I'll try to talk about, why I'm making certain decisions and why that's going to work with the game or not. So you can try to apply those to another art editor if that's what you want to use. But I think Pascal is pretty good for, just for learning and for creating a simple game. So, it's great to use if you like it. If you want to use something else, that is an option, but you're going to maybe have some headaches that you might not otherwise have. Okay, so a few links to some other resources if you want to look at more character design. This is like a YouTube video. I think these are all YouTube videos.
Building your business online?
Okay.
Go to
I don't have I need to install AutoScape. These are just some examples that I like of character designs. There's a million of these things on YouTube, but I just picked out a few good ones. This artist is using Photoshop, and they kind of go over, all the different choices that they made for the character and how they create kind of a design concept for the character. For Pascal, I've kind of gone over the basics, but if you wanted to go into more depth and learn more Pascal, this is a really good video series or YouTube series that kind of goes into more depth on all the different parts of Pascal. I guess this is just the first video. I wonder if the playlist, one of the annoying things about YouTube is it's hard to see where this playlist is. Maybe it's this. Yeah, there it is. Okay, it's that blue text. Okay, so there's this whole playlist. I should link to this instead. With videos that go into more detail on using Pascal. And I think this is another, oh yeah, this is another game design article. Kind of goes over some different characters and talks about different methods and stuff like that. So not required reading, but things that I think would be useful to check out if you have time. But yeah, I'm going to kind of use this example as a guide for creating my character. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to do, well, actually, I'll get into that in the next little part. Let me stop recording.